I think that alarm tells us it's now officially 10. So I'm going to go ahead and get us kicked off. Good morning, everybody. I'm Laura Brewer. I work for Attorney General Josh Stein. Thank you all for being here and for working with me through the technology over the last couple of days. Just to set us off with a couple of ground rules about how today's event will go. Various people will have time to talk. Please do keep your remarks limited to 3 minutes. You'll get a warning at 3 minutes if you need to kind of move along. And we will unfortunately have to mute you if you keep going, just because there's so much to get through today. So please do stick to that 3-minute time limit. I also wanted to mention that you will have an opportunity to add additional questions, and you will have an opportunity to weigh in more if you're not one of the folks who's speaking for the 3 minutes. And if you do have any questions, feel free to put those in the chat box. And also please include your email address if you put something in the chat box, so we can follow up with you afterwards if we don't get a chance to on today's call. Finally, members of the task force who are on, if you'd like to join the conversation, please use the raise hand feature on your Zoom, and we can add you in as a panelist so you'll have video and can add something to the conversation as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to AG Stein for his introductory remarks.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks for all the hard work that you and everybody who has done in order to pull together this regional roundtable. We all lament that we're not there in person because obviously the exchange could be that much better, but this is the best we can in the current circumstances. And so I want to thank everyone for participating in this Mecklenburg County Regional Roundtable on criminal justice and racial issues. This is something that we're doing through the task force, the governor's task force for racial equity and criminal justice. And on the Zoom with me is Associate Justice Anita Earls, who is the co-chair of this task force, along with me. Governor Cooper asked us to help shepherd this effort to identify and critically implement changes to our criminal justice system. I think that it is now widely understood. I think Black people have known this for a very long time, but I think increasingly white people have come to appreciate that the criminal justice system does not treat people equally, that Blacks disproportionately are arrested more, they get charged more, they have longer sentences, higher rates of conviction, they have more punishment in prison. So sort of at every level of the criminal justice process, things are not equal. And that is a fundamental violation of what our justice system should be about. You know, the words chiseled on the Supreme Court building are equal justice under law. And we're not there. And so the governor said, I don't want some blue ribbon commission to write a report that goes on a bookshelf. There are enough of those. I want change, and I want you all to identify and then work toward the implementation of real changes that can make a difference in the criminal justice system. So that's what we're about. We've had 2 task force meetings, full task force meetings so far. And in the second task force meeting, we as a group had universal consensus. And by the way, this task force has very broad representation, from people who are justice involved, criminal justice reform advocates, to mayors, county commissioners, judges, sheriffs, DAs, police chief, line officers. So we've got the full spectrum of perspectives represented, and we all agreed on 3 preliminary reforms. 1 was a ban on chokeholds, 2 was a duty to intervene and report, and 3 was a recommendation to the Supreme Court to institute a rule on judges to consider a defendant's ability to pay before levying a fine or fee, because we do not want to criminalize poverty. So we've had 2 meetings so far. We've broken up our work into 4 working groups. Each of those working groups have already met at least once and are meeting again this week to continue their work and advance our discussions. We've had 1 public comment session that was available to people to sign up from all over the state. And it actually turned out really quite remarkable. I was worried because we weren't in person, but I think in some ways it was better because people could call in from wherever they were and address us for up to 2 minutes and share their perspective and ideas. And it was very informative to the task force. And now we're embarking on a series of regional roundtables. We did one in the Triad last week, and we're doing today, Charlotte and Western North Carolina later this afternoon, and then the rest of the state this week. And this really is a really important opportunity for you all to inform our work. I mean, each of you has a unique and important perspective on what's wrong and what is right about our criminal justice system. And we want to hear that from you so that we can take that back to our deliberations. And by the way, Justice Earls and I are panelists here, but there are other members of the task force who are watching this through either Zoom or YouTube or whatever. So this is a real opportunity for you to advance our work. The way we're going to break it up is Justice Earls are going to give some preliminary comments as well. And then we're going to split our work substantively into a discussion on law enforcement, which I will moderate, and then a discussion on courts and beyond, which Justice Earls will moderate. I asked a few of the panelists to offer their thoughts on various questions within those broad topics, and very much look forward to hearing from people today. Justice Earls.
Thank you very much, Attorney General Stein. Good morning, everyone. I am really excited to have this opportunity to hear from you. Your input comes at a really crucial time for us in the work of the task force. And the reason for wanting to have these listening sessions is both to get a little more in-depth exploration of the issues, and also because we know that there are some important differences across the state. Differences in urban versus rural areas, also differences in what happens in the eastern part of the state versus the western part of the state. And so we thought that it was important for us to organize these on a regional basis so that we can really hear from you about what is happening in your community. And I also want to emphasize that the task force is not about change for change's sake. It's vitally important to understand the problems, but also to implement solutions that really work. And so I'm hoping that you can help us determine what those might be. And I know that you've got some unique initiatives in Charlotte. You have a police review board. I would love to hear feedback on the experience with that. Is it working? Does it need to be different? And you have the Race Matters for Juvenile Justice project that's been underway for 10 years. So to the extent that you can highlight for us things that you've tried, things that work, that would be enormously helpful. I want to also finally emphasize that all of you are really part of the solution. We know that as a task force, we are making recommendations. We are charged then for the second year and a half of our existence to foster the adoption and implementation of those recommendations. But we don't have a magic wand, right? We can't just wave our hands and make all these things happen. That it really will take your continued engagement and involvement on these issues at the local level, at the state level, both to be champions for the changes that we believe need to happen, as well as guiding that process. So I am thrilled that you are willing to spend time with us this morning. The final thing I want to say is that some of you may know the first 10 years of my legal career, 1988 to 1998, I litigated in Charlotte, including a number of cases where I represented the families of people who'd been killed by police. And without exception, they were African-American, but not all male. I had a couple of cases involving Black women killed by police. And I can say from that experience that my clients wanted more than what a civil lawsuit could bring them. They wanted to know that this would not, they wanted this to not happen to another family. And they wanted to know, what can we do to ensure that this wouldn't happen? And of course, in a civil lawsuit for damages, the legal system allows a family to recover money damages, but doesn't allow them to implement new policies or ensure that that particular officer isn't employed any further. And so I guess I say that to say that that the hearts and minds of many people in Charlotte, in North Carolina, are with us, with this task force, with the work we're engaged in, that people really do care that we make changes that will make a difference. And so I embrace this with a recognition of the challenge and the difficulty of what we're trying to achieve. but also a lot of faith and hope that we have the right people working on these issues and that all of you can give us good guidance. So with that, I will turn it back to Attorney General Stein so we can get started.
Thank you very much, Justice Earls. We are looking at the criminal justice system in its entirety, starting from that first interaction of a citizen and an officer, but not limited to that. We then carry it through the whole process, but really it's that first interaction that has triggered this national reckoning on race and law enforcement in the wake of the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others. And so I want to start with that discussion about use of force. I've told you we've made a couple of preliminary recommendations along those lines, but thought that that would be an appropriate way to begin our conversation. And I see Bishop Alexander is on with us and wanted to ask if he would address this topic, sort of a general comment of police community relations, which is so important to the ultimate success of public safety in a community.
Sure. Let me say good morning to everyone, and thank you for this. I think the first thing that I would put is this broad framework that people rarely understand until you actually tell them this. For 350 years, the official legal role of law enforcement as it relates to Black people in particular was to keep Black folk in their place. From the sheriff that was vested with authority to travel to return a runaway slave, to Bull Connor and others to keep Black folk from using restrooms or water fountains. The official role was to keep Black people in their place by any means necessary. And it is unrealistic to think that in 50 years, that just magically goes away. And so what we're talking about is something that goes deep beyond the law on the page. It is something that is inherent. And so that's number one. Now, what we have always found to be the case is that when you have something that deep and profound, then you need clear, strict laws and the enforcement of those laws that mitigate that behavior. So you're talking about swift and sure punishment of those who violate the rights and, to the extreme, take the lives of Black people. That has not happened. So you need deal with qualified immunity. How do we incent officers and their leaders to take action, both in the immediate threat of someone's life and in the aftermath? How do we reward a Gary McFadden, or now Chief Jennings, in terms of their leadership and the actions that they take? Kettling should be banned. And I know I'm just putting off a list of things that people can actually speak into with much greater clarity and depth than I. So I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Bishop Alexander. I appreciate that. Yeah, a lot of what you were getting at the issue of the culture of law enforcement and accountability, and how do you change the culture? Some of that's recruiting, and how do you have accountability? Some of that is citizen oversight. And we have Tanya Jameson, who's the interim chair of the Charlotte Citizens Review Board, on with us. And Tanya, if you can talk about this issue of accountability and how it works in Charlotte, and what you think is good, and what you wish was different to make your work more effective.
Well, so for those who are not familiar with the Citizens Review Board, the way we work is that a citizen files a complaint against a police officer, and then that complaint is then investigated by internal affairs. And then if the citizen does not agree with the internal affairs finding or the chief's findings, then they can appeal to us. But they can only basically appeal to us when it comes to use of force, firing a weapon. Robert, what was the other one that I forgot the last time? Oh, you're on mute. Arbitrary racial profiling was one of the other ones as well. The duty to intervene policy that has just been put into place for CMPD is actually not under our purview to review at the moment, but that's something that we're talking to the city manager about, and with Chief Jennings in the coming weeks, to see if we can get that under our purview as well. So when we talk about what works well, there's been a lot of frustration in talking to community about the fact that in the last year or so, we have had cases where the Citizens Review Board ruled against the chief at the time, but none of the there was like no reversal in what happened with the police officer. And so some people felt like there's just a frustration that it's like we make these rulings, and if we do go against CMPD, although in the past we've always pretty much ruled with CMPD, but in the last couple of years, we've actually had a few cases where the Citizens Review Board has ruled against CMPD, but there's no actual follow-up from the police department's perspective. Nothing happens to the officer's still on duty. There seems to be no actual repercussions, because if we do rule against a police officer or against CMPD, it goes back to CMPD to then therefore basically respond to what we say, our recommendations, and then it goes to the city manager. And then the city manager typically supports the police chief. And so there's frustration in the community, there's frustration among board members as well, that, you know, we take all this time, we do these hearings, we listen to the evidence, you know, we ask thoughtful questions. We're not just shooting off the cuff here. We're really taking the time, because we have the entire internal affairs investigation file. But then at the same time, once we make a recommendation and a ruling, CMPD has just basically come back and said, well, you know, thank you for your input, and we're just going to kind of continue to do what we have done in the past, or there's nothing as far as this particular officer that's going to be done. Now, I will say though, before I joined the board, and since I've been on the board, there have been recommendations that the Citizens Review Board have made, not pertaining to a specific officer being like reprimanded or punished for their conduct in a particular case, but there have been recommendations that have been implemented. So like the body worn camera being activated whenever CMPD goes out on a call, that was something that came through the Citizens Review Board. Citizens Review Board, in working with Robert Dawkins and the NAACP, we also helped craft some changes to the use of force policy that we have there now. There have been other changes as far as like officers activating their cameras in their motor vehicles when they're transporting a suspect or a person that has been arrested as well. So there have been policies and recommendations that have been implemented over the years that have come through the work of the Citizens Review Board. But when it comes to actually dealing with an officer, there's a frustration that's kind of where the buck stops when it gets to actually dealing with an officer. So that would be one of our things. And so in the last year or so, we were working with trying to work on the use of force policy. And so for Citizens Review Board, we really wanted to focus on getting CMPD to adopt more of a guardian versus warrior mentality. And CMPD came back with a sort of kind of hybrid definition of this, but we really would like to see it more of a guardian versus warrior when they're out there in the field and in everyday interactions. And duty to intervene and the policy and the suggestions that we had was an example of how that would look, because we were wanting to see duty to intervene happen in more routine interactions in the public so that we can create this culture where officers hold each other accountable to use de-escalation techniques to prevent getting to a point where you do need to use force in order to control a subject. And so we wanted to see—
Tanya, I'm sorry to interrupt. We're right at 3 minutes.
What, already?
Anya, thank you. You gave us a great deal to consider. The positive impact of Citizens Review Board in order of implementing or making policy recommendations that get implemented, but questions about limited jurisdiction and ultimate power to have your views adopted. So exceedingly helpful. Thank you so much. One thing that obviously we care about, actually Tanya talked about something I think a lot about, which is who we're bringing into law enforcement, and are they more of the public spirited guardian who wants to protect and take care of people and solve problems, or are they more of the warrior who wants to go in and run through a door? And we want to make sure that we have the right culture and that you shape people to behave how best serves the public. And training is a critical part of that. And so I see Chief Jennings is with us this morning. Chief, thank you so much for joining us, and wanted to know if you would offer some thoughts on training or these other broader issues.
Yeah, thank you, Tanya. I'd give you defer some of my time to you because you're on a roll there, but I can't do that. So, but yeah, I think the big thing for us is being more intentional, and we have been from the start of who we're recruiting, who are the people that are coming in to be police officers, and on the front, doing those psychological tests, those implicit bias tests, and making sure that we're doing a full review of our applicants before we even hire them. And then once they are hired, is to continue some of that process to ensure that we have the right people on board. And if not, we do have to figure out ways to better ways to be able to part with those individuals who don't fit. And it's important to us because any one individual or one individual officer can tarnish what we are trying to accomplish out there. And we need to make sure that when that's not going along with our mission and our goals within the department, that we have a way to basically part ways with that employee.
One thing that I have heard is that at state level with officers, that there will be sort of a preliminary analysis, kind of a psychological review, going through people's social media postings and such at the hiring stage, but that there's not a requirement that be revisited either 5 or 7 or 10 years out. And in contrast, the federal system, officers have that kind of review done every 5 years. And I wondered if you mentioned the idea of continuing the testing. Is that something that y'all have been doing, or you're looking at doing it? And what are your considerations in that regard?
Yeah, when it comes to implicit bias, absolutely. And we do have social media policies. However, that's not something we intentionally select officers to on a 5-year review or anything like that as far as their social media. However, anything that brings our department in disrepute that within anything that's posted social media wise, we do have a policy that does address that. And we've actually disciplined officers for that very thing, for putting things on social media that reflect poorly on our department. So, but no, there's not an annual or every 5-year review of social media with our officers.
Thank you. Sheriff McFadden, nice to be with you this morning. Appreciate you being here. Would you offer some comments on the importance of recruiting and training and all of these law enforcement questions we're discussing this morning?
Well, yeah, it is we do have, some people have a problem with recruiting and training. I don't have a problem with that. I'm going to be hopefully full staff by the end of the year. came in, did a very aggressive recruiting part of it. The culture has changed. The culture will change, and the culture will continue to change. But I think where I'm going to take my 3 minutes to kind of get off of here. This is a great idea, what we're doing here today. This is a great idea of our listening session. I think where the culture has to change also. Even the task force, the way it is made up, it has to change. For me, this is a good feel moment. It's a feel good moment for us. You know, you invite the city leaders here, and we're here leading our city, the grassroots organizations. But I feel still that, and this sounds crazy, coming from a sheriff standpoint, I don't feel that I have a seat at the table where we need to be to make change. Just like this task force. This task force is made up of people who we believe that will bring change. But to me, it's the same people who are on this task force. We hand select these people. We have the nice names to represent the people, and we all feel good being here today with you all and all these wonderful people and lovely faces. But we're just part of the listening session. We are not the change agent. The change agent comes with the task force. And so I think we even need to change the culture of the task force. The task force needs to be different. The task force needs to be more diverse. You know, if you have somebody at the judge levels, you need somebody on the street corner level on the task force. But I can tell you that's where my problem comes, because at the end of this, when the task force is done, myself and Chief Jennings still has to deal with the public, and we still have to deal with the grassroots people, and we still have to deal with the clergy, and we get no traction because we didn't have a voice at the task force level. And you know, that's the way I see that we can change it. Changing all this use of force and policies is easy. The night that we had the tear gas, I took tear gas off the table. The night that I saw George being killed on national television and talked to people, I put in a duty to intervene. You know, I changed the policy where we have a personal early intervention process where we will not allow someone to have 4 or 5 uses of force and we don't look at them strongly enough. We can do all this changing, we can do all these policies, but it takes us and allowing us to make that. So we change that. We can talk about racial biases and all this. If we have the numbers that say that we have a bad officer or we have a bad person, we should be able to do something about it. I know my friend Chief Jennings can't quickly take care of somebody, but I certainly can at the part of being a sheriff. And I have done it and will be doing it today of the same problem that I have. But I think where we miss the culture is still putting people on task forces that control the narrative. And then we suffer at the end. Is this a good task force? I'm not sure. Do I feel good about this task force? I'm not sure. Do I feel good about this call that we're on? The faces look good. We got all the people. We made sure that we got different backgrounds and different things. But our final say-so should be at the task force table. If we're going to see true change, the culture of creating these task forces and these groups and these committees also need to change. This session is good. This session is a great listening session, but when everybody goes back into the room to make the final decision and recommendation, we should be at the table also. And even with the larger counties, I don't think that is represented in this task force equally in law enforcement. I know I'm the largest county in the state and I'm not on the task force. Not saying I should be, but one of the other largest counties should have a voice because our demographics are definitely different than these smaller counties around the state. So if we're talking about true change and true difference, that's what we have to do.
Thank you, Sheriff. The task force is very diverse and broad and has a wealth of perspectives, both rural and urban. You know, we've Chief Davis from Durham on there. We also have a mid-sized town chief. So when the governor had to come up with 24 names, he couldn't put everybody on there. But that's exactly why Justice Earls and I are doing these regional roundtables, is because we want to make sure that everyone who isn't on the task force at least has the opportunity to present to the task force. And I think Justice Earls did a commendable job noting how our work can only be, we don't have the ability to implement anything. It is up to you all to implement at the end of the day. We can make recommendations to the legislature, we can make recommendations to police departments, to sheriff's offices, to judges, to district attorneys, but at the end of the day, we have to work together. So this is really important for us to have this relationship, because you are absolutely right. It is on you at the end of the day to make this thing work or not work. You're where the rubber meets the road. Yeah, those are my preliminary thoughts. Anyone want to comment on law enforcement issues, whether it's the policies and use of force, whether it's the accountability, whether it's recruiting, whether it's training? We have a few minutes now where we can open it up to other participants here. And I see Kevin just signal. So we'll go to Kevin for about 90 seconds, if you would, Kevin.
Great, thanks. And I think thanks for the invite. It's a great segue. I know how difficult it is to change culture. I want to commend Sheriff McFadden, because we have seen some changes in the way he's rewarded certain people in his organization that exemplify the changes he wants to make, and some of those are taking hold. But in changing culture, you need carrots and sticks, right? So you can have the carrots internally to reward people. The sticks are the punishments. You've got great people in Tanya and Robert on there for the citizens review boards and what can be done there. There are other people who can speak to qualified immunity. What I've always struggled with as a defense lawyer, criminal defense lawyer, is that we have something called the exclusionary rule, and it does address bad behavior by police, but it is so narrowly drawn. The punishments are only available if that bad behavior is directed at a particular legal issue, the stop or the search. I would like to see the smart people involved in this effort be able to craft something where we could, as criminal defense lawyers, litigate bad police behavior in a way that affects the outcome of the criminal case. I think if that was available on a more broad scale, you would see changed behavior by police. We don't see the abuses that we used to see in searches and things like that because of the exclusionary rule in part. And if we were able to litigate some of the violent behavior of police and it had an effect on the criminal prosecution of the case, I think that would be a big weapon in combating this.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate that. Interesting idea, one we will look into. Anyone else have something to comment on the law enforcement side? Yes, Robert, Mr. Dawkins.
Thank you, Attorney General. So again, and this goes back to what Sheriff McFadden was saying, ever since the day, and you were one of our proponents pushing for citizen review board changes all the way back in 2015. You were one of our champions on it, with Representative Moore, with all of them. We do not see how an advisory committee is ever going to change it. When we were talking about citizen review boards having subpoena, investigatory, and decision-making power back when the General Assembly was controlled by Democrats and we couldn't get it through. And we haven't been able to get it through even out of committee. So this is our last go round on trying that way. What I want to check on now is the legality of going to someone like a sheriff McFadden, that has subpoena power, investigatory power, and decision-making power, and saying, can we make them the citizen review board to oversee police misconduct, since the sheriffs are the most important law enforcement figure in the county, and we can't seem to get any type of remedy from the state. Is it legal for a sheriff to use his subpoena, investigatory, and decision-making power to hold a police department accountable?
Sheriff, do you want to address that?
Yeah, you ain't ever been shy. What, the microphone ain't working?
Shit.
Wait, me? You talking to me?
I asked you,
Yes.
I asked if you wanted to address Mr. Dawkins' comment.
Again, whatever makes the community trust us more, whatever brings clarity to the community, whatever brings transparent to the community, I'm willing to do that. Because again, after all of this is gone, and after everybody goes back into their offices, myself and Chief Jennings is going to have to deal with this. We deal with this on a daily basis. We don't deal with it seasonally. This is something that we are dealing with it daily. I believe at this point, we have the best chance and the best time to be the best example and show everybody. We are willing, everybody on here, I can say that I have seen or talked to at one point. Some of us don't always agree, but I guarantee you we agree on this. We all want to work together, and we all want to see the same thing. But it takes us having the power. If somebody says, give the sheriff the power, I will take that power. If I say, I think that we need a board to really take a second look at it, to take a second look at what we are doing and how we are doing it. You need to have a second set of eyes on a police shooting. You need to have a second eyes on everything. Why? We do that in every other thing. Have a second eyes, come in, look at it from a clear perspective and say, this is good, this is bad. You may even take a look at it differently. You know, a think tank, say this is good and this is bad. Until we do that, we're still gonna have this problem. The community don't trust us and we don't know how to give them trust. Some of us do, but then when other people get in the way, it's gonna cause us a problem. And at the end of the day, and I go back to and I know we say about this task force, at the end of the day, it looks good. We have all the names, we have all the sakes, but who suffers at the end of this? Most of the people on here. We're gonna get involved, Jenny's gonna get involved, the attorney's gonna get involved, the district attorney's gonna get involved, and then everybody watch us fight on the Hill. If you give us the power, I think, you give us the power, you give us the seat at the table, you give us the positions, I think that we can do great things together. I have a problem with nobody on this call and work with all of these men and women on this call, but you simply have to give us the power of the people who really want to change, not the people who are going to say yes all the time, not the people who's going to say, well, this is a good thing behind closed doors. We have the time and the position to make a difference if given the chance. If you want to give me that power to give a subpoena, I'll absolutely accept it.
I think that, I'm sorry, was somebody chiming in?
Yeah, Chief Jennings, I was wanting to jump in real quick.
Yes, please, go on, Chief.
So I just want to be clear and also, you know, I think it's been over a year now that our District Attorney Spencer Merriweather, who's also on the call, he implemented that we do not investigate our own officer-involved shooting. So the State Bureau of Investigations does that. And also I want to be clear too that we are one of the forefront agencies in holding our people accountable because we do actually generate more internal complaints than external complaints. And I know there's some thoughts and reasons behind that, but at the same time, you heard Ms. Jameson mention that our Citizens Review Board often sides with us because I think a lot of that also is relevant to the fact that we do take a lot of time and pride in our investigations internally and hopefully to get them right. And we do try to do that. So I don't think that there's some big mass cover up with internal investigations. I think when we do have those reviews and people take a look at the reviews of our investigations, a lot of times they see that we've done the right things and we've held people accountable. And that's not to say that there are going to be some times where there's disagreements out there as far as what our actions have and where we've gone with some of our disciplinary actions. And that's understandable. But our goal, like you heard Sheriff McFadden say, is we want to get it right. And we want to have that trust within the community, and we continue to fight for that. And we will continue to improve and get better.
I think, Mr. Dawkins, in response to your particular question about the legal authority to investigate officer-involved shootings, it would require a change of statute, but there's nothing that would prohibit an agency like CMPD from just creating a policy that says if any of our officers are involved, we're not going to have a fellow officer do it. We're going to have some outside agency to do that. And we heard the same thing in Forsyth on Friday. And because of, and this really is, I want to thank Sheriff McFadden for his quick action on a duty to intervene. When we as a task force see agencies like CMPD or the Sheriff's Department office making these reforms and initiatives, it tells us it can be done. And then it makes us stronger as a task force to make a recommendation to say, this shouldn't be only to the benefit of people in Mecklenburg. We need to take this and make it a statewide policy so that all of North Carolina benefits. And it will mean making recommendations to the legislature, which sometimes they may do it or they may not. I mean, I heard your frustration that it hadn't been acted on before, but that doesn't necessarily mean local departments and agencies can't on their own move forward in these ways. I do know that Mecca Williams had raised her hand earlier, and I wanted to give her the opportunity to comment. Are you still there, Ms. Williams? I may have, oh, there she is. You're back.
Hello?
Yes.
Okay, is it from some, I can talk now or somebody else?
Yours for about 90 seconds, if you would.
Okay, going back on some of the stuff I think you asked about some suggestive ideas as far as with policing.
Yes.
I just wanted to kind of recap, kind of short. When you look at racial profiling, I think a lot of people just look at that, identifying it as skin color, but we need to really look at culture profiling. Culture profiling go as far as like hairstyle, clothing, and a whole lot of other different things, and car profiling. Certain cars people get profiled. So if you box it all up in one, when you got the skin color, the culture, and the car profiling, the fake pinging, the 30-day plates, the so-called probable cause, as they say, different things of that. If you kind of balance all that out, then how many arrests or stops would you have if you take a lot of the culture, the car profiling, the racial profiling, and the pinging, those different things. So if you take that, then also I want to know who took the administrative approach to allow police officers to do trumped up charges, because you got police officers that patrol in the area for marijuana charges, and a black person to get charged to up to 1.5 ounces, and they might only have 1 gram, and a white person to get charged with less than. So you got to go back and look at those particular charges, that be their so-called PC, probable cause, but you're given a Trump charge, and then they go in court and say, well, I drop resisting arrest if you take the marijuana charge, but you got a trumped up charge when it should have been a citation. So we probably need to go back and start recapping that. If you take a lot of those things and factor it up, I really wonder how many arrests. And then maybe some psychological evaluations, mental health, if there's officers suffering from PTSD, like anybody else, that's human nature, with medicine evaluation, seeing how that go from a psychological standpoint. That would just be my take, and maybe start modifying the FOP because they have too much power. And another thing, maybe y'all can consider letting the city manager and the chief have more jurisdiction on the firing. If they make the recommendation that the officer needs to be terminated, I think it needs to really just be that, versus a civil service board saying, no, they cannot find something for them to do. If you got a bad apple, get rid of it. It's nasty. That's just my take.
Your take is valuable. Thank you very much for sharing. Appreciate you. Pastor Moss. Yes. If you could just briefly so we can get Pastor Moss as well.
Have we ever thought about having a statewide task force that it could, I know everybody's talking about law enforcement, police, SBI. Have we ever thought about having a task force that is combined with all other these law enforcement and lawyers and everything on officer involved shootings? So if Charlotte has a shooting, instead of Charlotte investigating it, we have a task force to come in besides the SBI that is a combination of all the entities in North Carolina. So it'll be a very independent thing.
That is something that one of the working groups can wrestle. We'll take it back to them.
I'll be glad to work on it with them.
Okay, thank you, sir.
And Mr. Stein, really quick, like when he's saying that, we mean besides for law enforcement, also like, I know like Judge Earls don't have time anymore, but she was one of our champions, or like a Henderson Hills. So it's not all just law enforcement. It's people that understand the letter of the law, but they also see it from an advocacy side and not just trying to find a hole in the law enforcement rules, if that makes sense.
It does make sense.
But we need to be, but that task force need to be able to respond to that city or that scene and not just simply take the paperwork and review it. That is in the most purest form. And so then have more clarity on it. And then when we bring it there, then we can say that you have your experts. I know, like, if you say murder and homicide, I could go to any city and find some other detective to say, I would love to work with him, combination. And so it would be a true independent organization. Instead of saying this is the SBI, you have a true independent task force to come in and say, just because you're working in Monroe and all the task SBI agents in Monroe to look at this, it'll be over the state. Then we can give the final to the other experts, let them look at it. You have an expert in blood splatter. You have, Mr. Hill. You can have then the public take a look at it. And then you say, this is the true findings of the shooting. That in the purest form would help everybody. And we would have the clarity. And I go back again. At the end of the day, I'm just trying to save myself and my brother, Chief Jennings, to going back and all the other sheriffs and law enforcement that goes through this every year. That's a true
I'm so sorry to interrupt. We're almost out of time on the lightning round. I just want to make sure. I think there's one more person that we needed to get in.
Nice. Thank you very much. Pastor Moss, you will finish this part of our agenda.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'll be quick. A lot of people have spoken today about cultural change, and I believe we can all agree that culture trumps procedures and mandates. The chief, I think, mentioned about the initial training, the psychological investigation. I'd like to add something to that. It would be great if the law enforcement agencies could use a virtual reality scenario testing without prep or notice to applicants and be evaluated by the chief, by the sheriff, mixed review team of community leaders and officers. I think that would go a long way in helping you to come alongside the psychological things that you're looking for, because people would not be able to prep for that. And it's been studied by Harvard, and it's been very effective in some other areas. Also, wanted to add, I think we also need to look at school policing and recognize that our schools are not prisons. And school safety personnel who have not passed a training program in child psychology or school cultures, de-escalation, etc., should not be in schools as a default for people who don't want to handle discipline. So I think those are a couple other things that we need to consider.
Pastor Moss, tell me the name of that training you said. I didn't catch the name when you said it.
It's virtual reality. It's an opportunity where you have reality scenarios, and people who are applying for the positions would be required to go through those prior to being hired.
Understood. Okay, thank you very much. Well, really appreciate everyone's thoughts and ideas as we wrestle with the law enforcement side of the criminal justice equation, and now hand it off to Justice Earls to lead the discussion as we look to the courts and beyond.
Yes, thank you very much. I am going to move us to talking about what happens in the court system, but I did just want to follow up, if I may, just really quickly with Tanya Jamerson. You talked about the Civilian Review Board, and Robert Dawkins talked about the need for subpoena power. I just want to confirm, are you saying that in the investigation or in the cases that you've reviewed, you've needed additional information that you've not been able to get?
Right, or we wanted to talk to witnesses, including police officers and third-party witnesses that did not appear before the Citizens Review Board.
Okay, thank you. And I want to assure everyone who is commenting in the chat that we will save that, and we will, so those comments will get attention. I noticed there's been a lot of comments in the chat about needing to have people with lived experience participating in the change, and that seems to me to raise the possibility that one of the recommendations that this task force make, that further ongoing efforts have greater involvement by directly impacted people. So I'd love to, either now or following up after this session, if anyone has any models or ideas of ways to do that successfully in this arena, that would really be helpful. So I think that the governor was appropriate to recognize that if you're going to address racial equity in criminal justice, you have to talk about what happens through the court system. And so we're going to turn first to Christy Puckett-Williams to talk about pretrial release and bail. But I also noticed that you were very active in the chat. And in particular, you suggested that SBI review of police or officer involved shootings was not effective. So if you wanted to elaborate on that any further, please feel free to do that as well.
I don't want to take up my little 3 minutes because I can go on and on about the police, but what I will say is that we don't trust the SBI either. And so that trust has to be rebuilt in order for us to even begin to consider having relationships with these organizations. Historically, we don't trust the SBI. But let me get into my comments because I know my time is ticking about pretrial and the court system. So in North Carolina, as Attorney General Stein noted earlier, the kind and amount of justice you receive is different if you are Black, brown, and or poor. The laws guiding system actors are the same, but the enforcement and application is not. One of the biggest drivers of mass incarceration around the country is the incarceration of people for misdemeanors. And that's true here in North Carolina as well, especially in Charlotte. Misdemeanor charges may sound like something small, but they carry serious financial, personal, and social costs, especially for defendants who are held on bonds they cannot afford, but also for our broader society, which finances the processing of these court cases and all of the unnecessary incarceration that comes with them. And then there are the moral costs. People charged with misdemeanors are often not appointed counsel and are pressured to plead guilty and accept a probation sentence to avoid jail time. This means that innocent people routinely plead guilty and are then burdened with the many collateral consequences that come with a criminal record, as well as the heightened risk of future incarceration for probation violations. A misdemeanor system that pressures innocent defendants to plead guilty seriously undermines American principles of justice. Also, the use of bail varies considerably from county to county. The law, 15A 534, hasn't changed and clearly lays out conditions of release that are non-financial that should be considered first. What we see happening across the state is that financial conditions are set with no consideration of non-financial conditions and no consideration of a person's ability to pay. Thereby, people are locked up pre-trial because they are too poor to purchase their freedom from the state. My suggestions are, people with agreed upon classes of misdemeanor charges be cited and released. For other classes of misdemeanors, if they are arrested, they should be released on the least restrictive non-financial condition. All people who are being held for probation violations that are technical in nature should be released, and we stop violating people for missing appointments, failing to pay, or even having drugs and alcohol in their system. Also, we should be using technology more in our court system. It is not lost on me and others on this call that the police in our city receive almost $300 million to lock us up and use some of the most advanced and militarized equipment available. And the courts are still using computer systems that are 30 years old and paper shucks. We have not invested in the technology that could alleviate the burden of coming to court. For example, using virtual hearings, Michigan had a failure to appear rate of 0.5% in April of this year, compared with 10.7% in April of 2019. Similarly, in New Jersey, Superior Courts, the failure to appear rate fell to 0.3% beginning in the middle of March when hearings shifted online. This compares with the prior rate of 20%. While these statistics are stark, they align with research showing that most people who miss hearings do so because of obstacles such as lack of transportation, the inability to take time off, or lack of childcare. A Utah study also found that these defendants who missed in-person court hearings while out on bail, 89% appeared within 3 months, therefore not becoming fugitives from justice. What the researchers don't talk about is the fear of being locked up at a court date is also a deterrent for people. I know for me personally, there were plenty of times I didn't show because I knew I was going to be locked up for failure to comply, often due to unpaid fees and fines when I got to court, so I just wouldn't go. In my opinion, these findings carry significant implications for both pretrial justice and community supervision. In pretrial justice, many routine hearings can be held remotely, but also with absconding being relatively rare, the primary reason to overcome the constitutional presumption of release prior to trial should be significant risk that the defendant will be arrested again for a serious offense, not a lack of accountability on the part of system actors to the law. What we want is the same: accountability and transparency. The system requires that of us, the people, and we want that to be present within the system and as actors. Right now, when there is a judicial or prosecutorial misconduct, nothing happens to those bad system actors. They're able to continue to harm the community, especially Black, brown, and poor folks with their unchecked power, and we want that to stop now. Thank y'all for your time. Please do not forget the 32,000 people who are still in our prisons despite the pandemic, the thousands in our jail, and free Ronnie Long. Thank you.
Thank you. You covered a lot of ground there. If your comments are written, I would really ask you to submit the written comments to us as well. And I also wanted to ask on the issue of pretrial release and bail, there has been already made to the task force a proposal that it doesn't change state law. It essentially tries to mandate adherence to state law to not use money funds. And so the task force has a website. It's ncdoj.gov/TREC. And everything that's submitted to the task force is on that website. I would love to get your feedback on that proposal. If you would take it should be there. We can make sure you get it, but just to get your thought, it's modeled on the settlement in Alamance County, where federal court has looked at these issues. So that's one possible step forward. On the issue of fines and fees, I wanted to ask you, so we already made a recommendation that the Supreme Court implement a rule, a general practice of rule that judges must consider a defendant's ability to pay before assessing fines and fees. And that may not be the full solution, but that's a start. And so if you had any ideas for further steps that we should take along fines and fees, that would be helpful as well.
I will get all of those to you all.
Thank you.
No problem.
So we're turning then to using data to promote equity. Spencer Merriweather, you have some comments on that for us?
Just one of the things that I found plaguing as someone who's spent 13, 14 years in this system, as we compare ourselves to other jurisdictions who have tried to give an honest accounting for what goes on in our court system. North Carolina is especially bad at the way that it collects data. There's been some discussion already about just how terrible we are electronically, but it is significantly limiting to consider how hard it is to collect data to answer specific questions about what goes on in the North Carolina criminal justice system. That said, the data, we know exactly what it says, which is that the impact upon communities of color is inherently racially disparate. And that's something that we all know, but in order to fix it, it helps to know exactly what corners of our criminal justice system are the worst and why. Just in my own office, we have in the last few months tried to link up with some academic organizations to try to take a look at our decision-making processes to see where and how we are contributing to racial disparities in the way that we conduct our business here. That's going to take a while. Some of it is about people actually taking a empirical look at our at the design of how we make decisions here. And some of it is just about collecting the data. And if I wanted to pull numbers tomorrow on how many convictions, how many cases brought in, who's actually getting convicted and in what neighborhoods and why, it would take me months to get that information. And I think that is to the detriment of the value of transparency. One of the things that, a little bit off topic, Justice Earls, if you don't mind, that at least want to put into the room. Often, vulnerable communities of color will have to rely on their interaction with the criminal justice system to have their first interaction with medical services that are required within our system. It is often that the first mental health diagnosis that comes to an African-American young person will be in the criminal justice system, because every other system across it has failed to provide that. So the mental health system, the mental health diagnosis that happens 2 years earlier that could have avoided a criminal interaction, 2 years later, we're seeing it in a justice system where something severe has happened and people have an expectation and they'll treat it like a crime, when behind that you've got someone who's sick. And we're not set up in a way to deal with that in the way we would want to. And 9 times out of 10, that is disadvantaging people of color. And as you think about broadly, as you think about the impact of the criminal justice system and what are some things that feed into it, lack of a mental health system that's worth a damn is one of the things that I think you have to be given some consideration to.
So I just want to follow up on one thing you said about the lack of data. And I'm just wondering whether your sense that the Chief Justice's e-courts initiative, which is an attempt to merge all of the court system data. I mean, she reminds us that some courthouses across the state are still using DOS-based computers, and that we have all these different computerized systems for all different pieces of data. Do you think that will that system transform your availability to get the kind of data you're looking for, or is it not?
It could help. I'm happy to hear that just last month, our office and court systems in Mecklenburg County had some of their first substantive conversations with some of those vendors about what that system might look like. I think the Chief Justice has been an extraordinary leader in the area, trying to figure out how we take some of these things off of paper. Quite frankly, we as system actors have a responsibility to move in this direction. I know I live in a county where our law enforcement agencies are among the last in the state to move a lot of their citations into an electronic format as opposed to a paper one. That has a physical cost to people. People who don't have to catch the bus and come and leave their jobs and do whatever have to actually come to court to deal with a pink written citation. Whereas in a lot of other counties, if they can just go online and do it, they can do it at their convenience. That's something that's not possible here. So the responsibility and obligation for moving in the direction of e-courts is unmet right now, and we've all got to be doing a little bit better. But even I won't know until I see it, and I have reason to be skeptical. So I'll leave it there.
Well, fair enough. But I'd also say the design stage is, and in particular, I think that AOC is open to hearing about ways that the system should collect data that allows us to move towards racial equity, right? So I think that whether it's through task force recommendations or otherwise, I think that, you know, the task force has a data team and we're trying to be research-based, but ongoing in the future, how do we have the data broken down by race in a way that managers such as yourself can actually manage and monitor what's happening? I think that can be a high priority.
Well, Justice Earls, let me drill down on exactly that point. Something that's real in the weeds as far as how it is that our prosecutor's office decides whether or not to accept a case for prosecution. If we haven't put significant thought into how you design that system alone and how we enter in information to determine whether or not we've accepted a case, then we can't figure out as a system important information on how we're deciding about whether or not to accept a case, what neighborhoods we're accepting cases in and which ones we aren't, which cases are failing because this is a terrible stop that's happened in this particular neighborhood. And I haven't gotten a lot of questions from the AOC about how to develop that portion of this system. And so you're giving me some information. Maybe I need to be putting it more in a racial equity context, but to date, I haven't been all that successful in pressing that point.
Well, that's useful to hear, and let's work on that.
Absolutely.
So now I'm going to take the privilege to go to my former law partner, James Ferguson, who was on our agenda, and give him the opportunity to address us, and whether it's policing issues or court issues or both. Fergie, do you want to take over and give us the benefit of your experience? We can't see you, but you appear to be there, but you're on mute. Can you unmute yourself? Well, I didn't give him enough advance notice. So Fergie, oh, there you go. You're on mute.
I should be unmuted by now, am I?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thanks.
Good. Well, I want to try to collapse 53 years into a few minutes, if I can. And simply to say that as happy as I am to see this group of elite, sharp, brilliant minds and experiences come together to address a problem that has plagued our criminal justice system ever since we've had one. I don't dilute, and having been on many commissions and study groups and advocacy groups and working in the criminal justice system and working with various organizations representing police, representing criminal defendants over the years, I'm not, I don't want to appear to be pessimistic about this, but I think if we're going to make any real change, it's going to come as a result of not just what you're doing now, but looking at the broader picture and trying to make sweeping changes. As I look at it, there are four areas I want to pinpoint as in great need of reform and change. And I think the people on this call and on this task force can be agents for change in bringing that about. Number one, I want to talk about the bail reform, the bail system. And I think we need to reform the bail system. But I don't think we need to tinker with it. I think we need to eliminate money bail. As I see it, that's the only way you're going to eliminate the kind of discrimination that we see in the bail system, whether it's racial discrimination, economic discrimination, or some other discrimination. No one should be deprived of his or her freedom because of his or her inability to pay. And I don't need to talk to this group about how communities of color, how poor communities, how minority communities are affected by a bail system that too often determines one's freedom on the basis of one's ability to pay. I won't say anything much more about that. I want to talk next about primarily our misdemeanor system, but also the felony system. One of the biggest problems I see and have seen over the years is that we are an over-criminalized society. Whenever we have a problem, we tend to think, well, we can solve this if we can figure out a way to put somebody else in jail. And that, I think, has led to a lot of our problems because we have too many people coming in contact with the criminal justice system in a way that they're being adjudged, guilty of a crime or not guilty of a crime, and dealt with as people who are undesirables in our community. In addition to eliminating pretrial incarceration for failure to meet bail. In our criminal law system itself, I think we need to take a serious look at decriminalizing marijuana and probably all drugs, and dealing with that as a public health problem rather than a criminal justice problem. I think about the huge numbers of people who can be eliminated from the criminal justice system, or released, I guess I should say, from the criminal justice system, if it were not for our society making a decision whenever it did, that the way to deal with drug problems is to find a way to incarcerate people or what they put in their bodies. To the extent that this is a problem, and it is a mental health, public health, I don't mean mental, public health problem. We should deal with it as such. And that would eliminate legions of contacts that law enforcement is having with citizens that they really don't need to have, and that they get no benefit from dealing with that. So everything from marijuana to opioids to any kinds of drugs, we ought to be thinking about eliminating that from the criminal justice system and putting it where it belongs, in the public health issue. The final thing I want to talk very quickly about is that race manifests itself in every aspect of our criminal justice system, but nowhere does it manifest itself more than in our death penalty system. So continuing to paint with the broad brush that I've been using, then I want to say that one way to eliminate a pocket of racism in our system is to eliminate the death penalty. I know people say that's idealistic, but we have eliminated the death penalty at least 3 times, and it has had no effect on increasing the crime rate. We eliminated the death penalty for arson. We eliminated the death penalty for burglary. We eliminated the death penalty for rape. And in neither one of those aspects was there a spike in any one of those crimes. So when people talk about the death penalty and crime rates, they're totally off base. It had no effect on the crime rate. And I submit to you that the same thing would be true if we eliminated the death penalty for murder, which is the only crime for which it's used now. And it's the one area of the criminal justice system we've had studies which demonstrate that race plays a pervasive role in the administration of the death penalty, and has over the years. And I challenge anyone to come with scientific proof that the death penalty somehow reduces crime. It reduces human life, but not crime. So those are the broad brushes I want to paint with today, given my work over the past 50 years, 50 plus years, in trying to address this pervasive, pernicious, and persistent problem of race and how it manifests itself in our criminal law system. I'm sure I talked longer than I should have, and I'd like to talk more, but I'll stop.
Well, thank you. No, that was very helpful, and your perspective is enormously helpful. So thank you for taking the time to be on with us. I'm going to go right to our next person, Dominique Cam, if you're there. I know you may have had to jump off for a hearing. Dominique, are you there? Can you speak next? Okay.
Hello.
Yes, hi.
Right.
Do you have a moment to share with us?
I do. Let me get these thoughts out real quick. All right. So thank you all for the panel. Dominique Cam with the Freedman Law Group here in Charlotte. I'll try to go through these real quick. So between new legislation, police policy, and judicial interpretation, there needs to be more restrictions on officers pulling out drivers from their motor vehicles for what is supposed to be routine traffic stops. there's a lot of trust in it, specifically with some Black people in the community. We don't necessarily trust law enforcement. You're allowed to lie about some of the encounters and why they're pulling people over. So there's this anxiety, there's this nervous, there's all these things going through your head, and then officers trying to remove you from your safety zone for unclear reasons. In addition to that, you're talking about this being allowable under Pennsylvania versus Mims, which it's supposed to be for officer safety, but there's a lot of times when there's nothing about officer safety. And that put people at risk, that puts officers at risk. And then sometimes things escalate where you're talking about people being forced out of their car or car windows being broken. The other thing we're talking about, racial policing and poverty policing, some of the factors that officers sometimes use are being in a high crime area or a low opportunity area, being nervous, looking around at the police, or not pulling over immediately in the dimly lit, very unpopulated area. So people being double, penalized for not feeling safe when you're living in specific areas. And these are being used as reasons to help pull someone from the car under the guise of officer safety. Another part that's kind of tying into that is we need to use mandatory use of consent to search written form. So they already did this policy in Durham. They've done this policy in Fayetteville. Pairing this with body camera, I think, would be highly effective to reduce pretextual stops and also create more accountability. One of the other things I would like to kind of tie some of this all in with is lawsuits can change policies, but they also cost money. And qualified immunity reduces incentives to challenge minor excessive force incidents or malicious prosecution incidents where they're charged with just a standalone resist public officer just because they didn't do what the officer said, how the officer felt they should do it. So bad policing can become a learned practice until someone gets severely brutalized. It's a high bar for the qualified immunity in general, and then you're talking about $300 for filing fees, $2,000 for depositions, $500 for mediation, criminal attorney fees, plus civil attorney's fees. It becomes very, very expensive for everyday people to actually sue the police and bring up some of these things other than filing a complaint. And even when you're talking about filing a complaint, I think some other people have touched on the lack of transparency, the uncertainty of kind of what goes on with filing a complaint and then getting to civilian review boards, and then actually sometimes officers being fired and then being brought back on. That's a whole nother conversation. But just in general, having better policing and talking about people not being pulled out for traffic stops. The last part, I think we've all talked about the statistics when it comes to Black people being pulled over disproportionately charged. I think we're all aware of that. We need to decriminalize marijuana, period. Phil Dixon in the School of Government blog showed that the war on drugs is mostly a war on marijuana. And hemp has been legal for years, but in 2019, a memo put out saying there's no generally available field test that can distinguish hemp or marijuana in odor or appearance. However, there's no legal advisory opinion on that, and there's some disparity between the counties on how this is enforced. The last part, and I have way more I can put in writing, but the last part with my time, I think some people already touched on this, but I think we do need to create or use resources from to shift over agency or create a new independent statewide agency to oversee law enforcement for random body-worn camera audits, also for complaints of excessive force from local civilian review boards. I know there are quite a few areas that don't have it. We talk about smaller areas, and then there are people who are frustrated with them in the localities that they are. And the last thing that an agency would do, which I think we can incorporate more, is a parallel investigation of police-involved shooting, which I think that's already been discussed. So those are kind of my things. Any questions on that?
Well, thank you so much for talking with us in the middle of trying to appear at a hearing. Really appreciate your time. If you do have some submissions in writing, please make sure we get them.
I definitely can.
And we are running, I'm running over time, but Judge Carla Archie and Judge Ricky McCoy Mitchell have been very patient with me. And so I definitely want to make sure that we hear from both of you. So Judge Archie, please.
Justice Earls, Attorney General Stein, and members of the task force, other guests on the call, good morning. I think it's still morning, yes. Thank you for the opportunity to provide some input from my perspective as a Superior Court judge. I tend to think of the criminal justice system as a compilation of individual actors who bring with them all of their life experiences and their related biases. What we know is that everyone has bias, and bias is not in and of itself a bad word, but it can negatively and unconsciously affect our decision making. As a Conference of Superior Court Judges, we've launched a racial equity training series in which we seek to help our colleagues identify racial bias in the criminal justice system, take a closer look at how implicit bias may influence our decision making, and develop tools and practices to interrupt default behaviors. I'm also aware of equity training that's been developed by the Mecklenburg County Criminal Justice Services Department in partnership with other local criminal justice stakeholders. It will be available in an online self-guided format. And I urge the task force to consider opportunities to have all criminal justice actors statewide to participate in equity training, not just one time, but on an ongoing basis. One, to address employee turnover, and two, to change the underlying culture. Because without refreshers, people have a tendency to revert to old habits, decisions, and behaviors. While the work of the task force appears to be focused on closing the disparity gap in systemic outcomes for people coming into and through and then out of the criminal justice pipeline, most days when I am presiding over criminal court from Mecklenburg County all the way to the Tennessee line, I'm focused on solving individual outcomes. And by that, I mean the contributing factors that lead someone into the criminal justice pipeline, and then the collateral consequences that result after they exit the criminal justice system. Things like adverse childhood experiences, educational deficiencies, unemployment, underemployment, mental illness, and substance use disorder. What your data team, the task force's data team, is likely to uncover is that much of this information, as DA Merriweather talked about, is either non-existent or insufficient to drive equitable individual outcomes. What we need is a statewide data collection protocol that's not just dependent on local resources, so that small, rural, and poor communities can capture the same information and have the same problem-solving ability as large, urban, and or affluent communities. In addition to data collection, part of the key to developing equitable outcomes, whether they are systemic or individual, is having a broad cross-section of stakeholders at the table. Others have mentioned, and I urge the task force to solicit input from professional disciplines that overlap the criminal justice system, like education and psychology, or input from people directly impacted by the system, or advocacy groups that represent their interests, like returning citizens. Lastly, I want to urge the task force to stay engaged in the follow-up steps needed to implement your recommendations, like assigning tasks to responsible departments and parties with target due dates and specifically defined success metrics, so that the community can actually see and feel the tangible results of your labor. Thank you for this listening session, and thank you for the opportunity to be heard.
Well, thank you so much, Judge Archie. I really appreciate those comments. I'm going to go directly to Judge McCoy-Mitchell.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity as well. And I guess we are still at morning. Good morning, everyone. Most of us, if not all of us on this call today, have heard that adage of, if you do not have a seat at the table, you're likely on the menu. And that's where I think we are. Although in agreement about the task force and a lot that it has going on and moving forward in diversity, unless I missed it, I did not see someone who actually was directly impacted by the system as a part of the task force. And I'm hoping we have that not just through some focus groups or subcommittees, but that voice is critical at the table to be able to give that perspective, as opposed to us oftentimes taking a paternalistic approach to telling people what they need instead of asking them. And even as we think about our juvenile justice system, the sad part is that we see almost a smooth, seamless transition from juvenile court into adult court. And that voice needs to be there as well, as an equal partner participating. And if we have any thoughts that our young people are not at a stage where they can provide that input, we are sorely wrong. being the chair of our youth initiative, our young people get it, and they need to have an opportunity to be able to voice that as well. As we think about specific things that we have going on too, and several have brought that up, when we look at our misdemeanors and infractions, when we think about a class 3, that these are oftentimes young people, mostly Black and brown young men and women, coming into court without representation, and oftentimes leaving now with a conviction. Those, we really do have to think about what that long-term effect will be. And even if we say, let's have some deferred prosecution, deferment programs, if you don't have the money to pay for those, you don't have an option. They need to be free. Now, I know Judge Archie talked about some of the implicit bias, but I want to go heavier as well on that. All those things we just said, talked about, unless we have not optional, but mandatory training and implicit bias for judges, for lawyers, for law enforcement. And as we have the Race Matters for Juvenile Justice, we've been able to move forward a collaboration with folks who are willing to come to the table, like our DA, like our chief, like our sheriff, like our PD, who invest in what's going on and make sure their offices are invested with decision makers at the table, not just anyone coming there to be representative. And so until we learn, and I certainly also encourage our task force to participate in our racial equity workshop, because all of this still has to be seen through a racial equity lens, or we may be doing some additional damage. And we learn that by learning more. So we have to be willing to learn that, to implement it, or else we'll find ourselves pretty much back where we are now. So I think I kept it up, rushed, but kept it under my time there, Justice Earls.
You did, thank you. And no, really appreciate, those are really helpful observations, so thank you. I have been a bad timekeeper, but I want to leave at least a couple of minutes for anyone who wants to, if you want to raise your hand and give us 90 seconds, particularly if there's an issue that we haven't talked about so far that we definitely need to make sure we consider. I see, I don't see anyone raising a hand. Oh, Kevin Tully, go ahead.
I put it in the comments. Thank you, Justice Earls. I put it in the comments, but so many of the people we're talking about that are directly impacted by our criminal justice system cannot afford a lawyer. And so they are assigned lawyers. So I think any type of equity progress that is going to be made has to recognize the critical role of funding properly indigent defense in this state and giving lawyers the resources, the lawyers who are representing people, the resources so they can provide the type of representation that people deserve but cannot afford.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a comment they want to make? Okay, Henderson, please go ahead.
Hi, good morning. I'd like to echo something that Bishop Alexander and Fergie mentioned, and that is that we need to aim high. That the challenges of racial equity in the criminal justice system date back 350 years. And if we don't look ambitiously and aggressively to rip the culture that says lives that are Black, lives that are poor, disposable, we're going to fail in the opportunity to achieve racial equity. And I think I'm glad to hear and to participate in this task force that the governor has assembled, largely because there's confidence that we are at a historical moment that we can attack the large narrative that supports so much that is oppressive about the criminal justice system. And I think Fergie had it right. The death penalty permits folks and the system to look at lives as disposable, of having no value. And that same narrative colors through the bail problems, it colors through extreme sentencing. And so I'm hopeful that we will take a look at not only the death penalty, but sentences, life sentences, sentences of 50, 60 years where folks are disposed of by the system, and look for ways in which we can redress some of those extreme sentences, especially since many of them have been passed only over the last 30, 40 years, when we know that the war on poverty was really, the war on crime was really a war on poverty and the war on communities of color. So I'm hoping that we look at these large narrative issues, that we look towards the technology and the other ways to implement a more equitable system, but keep our eyes focused on these larger pieces that make the system so unfair. Thank you, Justice.
Well, thank you. I think that's an excellent summary and note to end on. So I'm just going to turn over to Attorney General Stein to wrap things up.
Just to say thank you to everybody. This was a very engaging and provocative conversation. I really appreciate everyone's time and everyone sharing their deeply felt and well thought through recommendations. And we look forward to chewing them. Thanks so much.